Welcome to War, Revolutions and Terror. This is the next week in the lecture on the Russian Revolution. And as we discussed with the French Revolution, we have to understand what is happening in the socio-political and cultural terrain to really make sense of this great event and why it played out the way it did, and how really the forces that were involved in the revolution all come together at a certain juncture, and there's a certain intransigence and an inability in a sense to do much different. This is in that sense, there's something that seems inevitable about the revolution, and that's how we see it retrospectively, because we can see all the forces at work. At the time that it breaks out, no one knows how it's going to play out. No one is sure of that. Now, as in the French Revolution, the elite, the intelligentsia in this case, even more so, in the French Revolution, you'll recall that I emphasized it was the urban professional classes, their securement of political rights, their securement of political position that fitted, in a sense, the social position that they had already garnered. That this would be decisive in the way in which the revolution was self-understood, but also the conflicts that occurred within the revolution. In the case of the Russian Revolution, you will recall me saying that the major blocks that mattered were the army, and we looked at the Decembrist revolt. We will see how the breakdown in the army in the First World War, how the ability of the Bolsheviks to garner sufficient support within the army would be a decisive factor in their victory. Secondly, the peasantry, and we will see that, and the peasantry merely by sheer numbers, insofar as many peasants have been dragooned into the army and were unhappy with that, and also other aspirations by the peasant class, especially towards accumulating more land, that would play an important role. But as I've also signaled, they would be the big losers of the revolution, huge losers of the revolution. The working class, although in terms of absolute numbers, they're relatively small, in fact, very small, in terms of the overall population. Their strategic placement in capital cities, so in urban centres, at a time when modernization is so important, their disruption to the work process through strikes, so their willingness to, or their desire to radically transform their conditions would be very important in the revolution. And the intelligentsia as the head of the revolution. We will see that the intelligentsia, their role, and the culture of this particular intelligentsia is going to be very important, because the culture, the political culture of the students, which expands to include, or which includes acts of terror as part of its own commitment, political activism. This is very different to what is happening in other places in the main. But it's going to be decisive here. And to some extent, I want us, when we get to talk about the Bolshevik coup, to bear in mind that the hard will, the iron will, if you like, of certainly of Lenin, but of the Bolsheviks more generally, because ultimately, even when some of the Bolsheviks disagree with Lenin, they ultimately support him. That will to pursue its program is very much in line with the political culture that had been fostered amongst the intelligentsia. Now, a lot of intellectuals were not supporters of Bolsheviks, although, as we will see, they were nearly all socialists of one sort or another. And in this respect, I'm not completely convinced that once certain other things had taken place, other collisions had transpired in Russia, that it would have made that much difference which group, whether it was the socialist revolutionaries or the Mensheviks, who generally, we could say, were far less willing to go as far as the Bolsheviks. That's the best way to put it. Had they been successful in creating an alliance and defeating the Bolsheviks, I'm not at all convinced that it would have necessarily been less bloodless. And that's because I think that the forces in collision were such that they had got locked into this situation that if you were going for a program, and that program required the elimination of private property, which is another way of saying the elimination of certain classes, if that had taken place, I don't really think it would have mattered that much who had it. That is to say, I think the different personalities, the more forceful personalities, would have emerged from different groups and would have been forced to make pretty well the same kind of decisions they made, with what the rider to that, or the qualification of that, if they were going to implement the program. So the program is going to be really important. Okay, but let's now just speak more generally about some of these other forces. I will be staggering the history, so to speak, because I'll be moving between chronology and also with an eye to structural features, and then with an eye to different decisive events that give shape to the revolution. So, speaking now of the student movement, we can say that the desire to bring Russia into a more modern age go back as far as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, that they had both recognized, these great czars, that Russia was a great empire, a great military power in its way, but that economically it was still very much a serf society, so it was still very backward. At the same time, they were interested in ideas coming in from the West, and the West looked like, and was indeed, developing much quicker economically. So the ideas of the Enlightenment, and bear in mind that really what the Enlightenment is doing is not only saying that through human reason we can adjust society to make it more open to being freer and more equal. Not that that was something in particular that grabbed people like Catherine the Great or Peter. But the fact that rational understanding of how we make the world could contribute to making a better world. This was the key point of the Enlightenment. But that also, another way of saying that is those people that have both the opportunity and ability to cultivate their reason, in other words, it's a certain kind of person, is being privileged. And that person is someone who's literate, well-read, well-spoken, who can argue well. So they're the basic conditions. It doesn't mean, actually, that they necessarily really understand the world that well. And that's really going to be, that's really critical here. And I pointed out earlier in that lecture on Marx that he doesn't put much pressure, he doesn't put any pressure upon his solution. He just thinks he's got a solution. So you could say that's a real intellectual failure. And generally, I would say, intelligentsia have been too quick to think that they've solved problems when they often really lack sufficient information about the complexity of the problem. Now, relating also the intellectual class to the process of modernization and the requirement that that process has for the cultivation of urban professionals, you can see that there is a gravitation, there's a fit ultimately between the requirement to have professionals, people who are skilled in law, people who are skilled in speaking, people who are administratively skilled, people who are skilled in words and ideas, but also people who are engineers, doctors, scientists, the whole panoply of professions are required to make it to ensure that a society is modern. And you have to train them. So you need a place of training. And hence the university is an indispensable feature of any country wanting to modernize. And as we'll see, in part the tragedy of Russia was the very key to the solution was also a huge source of the problem. That is, the very thing that could help modernize Russia was also the thing that was going to, also the force that would bury the autocracy in Russia. Okay, in the middle of the 19th century, the entire student body in Russia was about 3,000 people. That's very small. And originally it was open to the children of the nobility and gentry. But the student body, and indeed the Crimean War drove home to the Russian leadership of the danger of not modernizing quickly enough. It was vulnerable. At the same time, in the 1860s, so shortly after the Crimean War, the student body grows, but the ideas it has about what is to blame, who is to blame, that's the name of a famous novel that came out of Russia in the mid-19th century. Who is to blame? Another title, these give you very good insights into what is driving the show, is What Is to Be Done. And basically what we see is that the student movement is forming itself into populist revolutionary groups sympathizing with the plight of the peasants, idealizing the communal structures that exist within Russia and within the peasant villages and communes, because it was largely a kind of peasant community, or made up of peasant communities. It was very collectivist, but it was collectivist for a group that knew each other, that were, in a sense, participating in a collective in a very personal way in the decision-making process. And a number of the radical students saw this as ultimately the way to create a good society. I will come back to that, but that's going to be very important. So there's this link up between the imagined, on the part of the intelligentsia, they're linking up with the peasantry through adopting the solution which they imagine can be transposed out of what is a peasant-like condition to the greater society as a whole. As we will see the development of the revolution, you see that was impossible. As early as the 1858, a group of professors publicly complained that the student is no longer a pupil but is becoming the master, guide of society. And this is the key thing, is the student strongly believed that the ideas, most of which that were coming from a couple of primary sources. They were either coming in from the West, you might recall this from last week, coming in from the West via philosophical ideas. We will call a number of the leading intellectuals of amongst the Russians. They had all studied in the West. They'd all travelled in the West. They'd all learnt something from the West, and they took these ideas back to Russia. But the other place they were looking, as I just said, was the peasant communes, and so they were connecting these things together and coming up with a kind of hybrid political set of solutions, but which, and this is the all important thing, which they knew the answers to. So they were going to be the representatives of salvation, so to speak, of the society. And because of this growing conviction amongst this group of, remember, these are students, they've read a few books, their experience in the world is very limited, but they're in a society that is so vastly, predominantly illiterate, that these look like geniuses compared to everybody else, and they're all trying to outdo each other in expressing their desire for change. They can see that things are really precarious, to put it bluntly, in Russia, that it's not a wealthy country, that there are serfs, at least up until the releasement of the serf, the elimination of serfdom. There's not that many opportunities. So they think, as I said, these texts, who is to blame? And the answer is, well, who is to blame is the old order. That this class structure exists because this has been superimposed upon people who would otherwise be free. One of the great formulations of modern radicalism is in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract, where he begins, man is born free and everywhere is in chains. Now that sentence is a lie. Man is not born free. No one is born free. But the second half of that sentence, everyone is in chains, is the exact idea that appeals to a group that believe that they have the knowledge of how to emancipate the society, of how to free that society, how to unleash that energy, and everybody could have what they want. If you think about it for a while, or not that long really, if you think about it, that suggests that people would automatically have plenty simply by what? By what? Collectively making decisions together. In a sense, it was a similar kind of narrative that had developed in the French Revolution. But that didn't solve the economic problems that they had in France. Simply changing the political order didn't solve the political problems at all. It didn't solve the economic problems at all, sorry. So the political solution, the economic problems, it wasn't necessarily a fit. What you have to do is find ways to modernize. And there's basically two ways to do that. You can do that through commercial incentive, or you can do it through dictatorial fiat. Ultimately, as the Russian Revolution played out, it gravitated much more to dictatorial fiat, to dictatorship of you must do this, and then we can modernize. So what I'm suggesting here is the way in which the solutions envisage the solution is extremely abstract. When we get to what the Bolsheviks were doing to try and actualize the program, make the program real, there we can see what has to be done. What is to be done? Let's translate. What must be done? What must be done? And so this whole student movement, it's dealing in big principles, big abstractions, and at the same time, because there is a Russian secret police, it has to operate in secret. We recall that members of the Decembrists were sent off to Siberia. Some were killed, but most were sent off to Siberia. They were sent off to exile. And this is the way in which the Tsar, or the Tsarist authorities, ultimately dealt with their opposition. They did it through secret police, censorship, exile, and occasional executions. Ultimately, though, this only fed into the opposition to them, because anytime someone was exiled, or, as I said, on occasion even hung, or any time an act of censorship took place, or an infiltrator was discovered, a secret policeman, this would confirm to the students the absolute oppressive nature of the state. So they would overthrow that. Now, what we see, though, is very early on, it starts to mimic, it starts to replicate, to copy the exact kind of aspects of force and censorship that is being deployed against this. Then, that is, anyone who speaks against this group, they have to be silenced. They have to meet in secret. They have to infiltrate other groups. They have to operate in secret. And at some point, the decision is made. They have to use terror. And again, we will recall with the Decembrists, we can see in some of the early, some of the writings of the early Decembrists and some of the decisions that were made by some of the Decembrists, that terror was going to be on the cards. And this is, so what happens is that the student bodies become cells of terror. And the first act of terrorism against the Tsar is in 1862, where Dmitry Karakozov fires at the Tsar. It's a shot, and it is shot pregnant with future, and we will see that terrorism spreads like a cancer in Russia. It's not only the Tsar, but any state functionaries are going to be seen by these more radicalized members of the student body, which are considerable numbers now. That is, where the number of the student body that is radicalized is a sizable number. Perhaps as many as half, perhaps even more. So these secret societies get set up. Now, in this respect too, special mention should be made of a character called Nechayev. Nechayev organized all these secret societies. He also linked up at one stage with Mikhail Bakunin, who I mentioned in an earlier lecture. And Bakunin was an anarchist who consorted with Marx and was a member of the First International. He fell out with Marx. But he had an important reputation in Russia and even outside of Russia. But Nechayev was actually gathering information on Bakunin in case he needed to. So initially, Bakunin was really fascinated and intrigued by and supportive of Nechayev. But then he discovered that Nechayev was collecting information on him. Indeed, what was happening in Nechayev's groups that no one knew who, except Nechayev, knew who were parts of his groups, and he was getting them to spy on each other. This is really, again, you can see that there's a sort of foreboding in this. This is sort of anticipating what will take place once the Bolsheviks gain power. How there will be all sorts of intrigue and plotting within the group against each other, and ultimately it will be the master of intrigue, and that will eventually be Joseph Stalin, who will be the victorious figure in his ability to understand the to and fro of the different groups and insinuate himself as a necessary figure to draw them into his tactics for his strategy for ensuring that the program can be implemented. Now, at this stage with the terrorist groups, as I said, it's all very, very vague. Marxism, to some extent, when it enters, and Capital, as we see, will very shortly after gets translated, when it enters into Russia, this looks more like a program. But as we will also see, actually, it's very vague. and it's even more vague in this early stage. So anyway, Nechayev gets involved, he and a number of his associates, all operating in these secret cells, none of them sure who all the other members are, except Nechayev. They murder a former member who disagrees with him on some tactics, so they murder him. Nechayev ends up in a prison fortress, Tsar prison fortress. He's so charismatic that some of the guards then are reading his material and they plot to help him escape. It's ultimately thwarted. So what you see is people that are very charismatic. They're very good at using words. They're very persuasive. They have a vision of how the world can be changed. They don't have any real experience in terms of managing anything, in terms of having achieved anything economically. Their prowess is in their ability to persuade. It's in many ways, if you do the course of mine, Foundations of Western Civilization, persuasion is at the basis of politics. It's very important in ancient Greece, the concept of that. The great play, the Aristeia trilogy, in the Libation Bearers, which really sets out the triumph of democracy in Athens. You see the special place that is allotted to persuasion. So these are, in a sense, a political class has to be a persuasive class. They have to use language well. But, as the example of Nechayev indicates, at some point, force is going to play a role as well. Now, here's from another group. So there were lots and lots of these secret cells. Now, we mentioned Karakozov, sorry. His cousin wrote this, and I think this is typical of the mindset of members of the secret society. So this is a group called Hell. A member of Hell must live under a false name and break all family ties. He must not marry. He must give up his friends. And in general, he must live with one single exclusive aim, an infinite love and devotion for his country and its good. For his country, he must give up all personal satisfaction. And in exchange, he must give hatred for hatred, ill will for ill will. Okay. It's a total life commitment. It is exactly the same kind of thing that the Christian martyrs believed, or Muslim martyrs in the case of the Christian martyrs, except they didn't deploy violence as a tactic, but they would give up, forsake everything for their objective. But in this case, it's that. So there's a kind of messianic dimension to this, because it is a new faith, to put it very bluntly. It's a transference from all the appeals that religion has in terms of orchestrating your energy in order to have a meaningful life, and it's transferring that into this world. So it's not in any kind of beyond, it's this world. You will remake this world. You will make it in such a way that the human race will be redeemed. It's very religious, but of course it's also anti-religion, anti-traditional religion. So it doesn't seem like it's religious. And this new kind of religion, we can say, is ideology. It's an ideological commitment, but it's gather the whole person to an absolute objective, which this person then will participate in trying to actualize. Now, I had mentioned this alliance that in Russia, basically, it came down to the fact that ideas from Marx would come into Russia, and they would really play a huge role in, certainly for the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and to some extent the SRs, but certainly the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks were captivated by Marx's analysis, which we've already given. The populist movement generally picked up, as I said, from the peasant communes in Russia. But they would go and preach socialism to the peasants, and I think a lot of the peasants just scratched their head and thought, well, yeah, it's good to get rid of anyone above us, but we don't want the state taking over. But at this stage, these populist movements, they didn't really talk in terms of replacing the Tsar with a new kind of state. They spoke in such a way as if it would just be the expression that decision-making would just be the expression of the popular will. Now, that really doesn't tell you very much at all, because the complexities of information gathering are broken between competing interests. As I've mentioned before, that's the very basis of politics. That's why politics exists. It's why it has come into existence. These things are just put aside as if, to put it bluntly, words would solve it all. So, at the same time, this Narodnik movement, which takes off in 1873, but its roots earlier than that, it sees itself as preparing for a peasant uprising, but it's also resolving again to commit terrorist activity by executing bureaucrats and policemen. One of these populist revolutionaries, who would also become one of the earliest and seminal Russian Marxists, was a woman called Vera Zasulich. She was a daughter of an impoverished noble, and what we see time and time again is that the leading members of the intelligentsia and the revolutionaries, they tend to come from noble, often de class A, but gentry backgrounds. And she had attempted to assassinate the commandant of St. Petersburg. Now, the important thing, there was a public trial, it was very well attended, very well reported. Now, the important thing was, ultimately she gets let off. And this is a symptom of the fact that popular, at least in the urban centres where there's a sense of what it is, the popular sympathy is with her. So she gets acquitted. She's as guilty as hell. But popular sympathy is with her. So the ideas of the student movement are already spreading socially, and they've been very persuasive. And the tactic is also increasingly accepted, because this is the moment where basically the population has said, okay, well, maybe terrorism is not that bad. And this in turn would spark off further waves of terror. And then we get this dialectic of state persecution leading to more terror. The more the state persecutes the terrorists, the more the terrorists are convinced and can convince that the autocracy is so terrible, that the authorities are so terrible. Look how vicious and violent they are. That's why we have to throw bombs. That's why we have to assassinate people, because there is no other way of doing it. So it feeds into that. It helps it grow. I'm not saying, by the way, one argument that we could make is that the Tsarist authorities failed because they simply weren't cruel enough. They simply weren't persecuting enough. I'm not making a moral claim here, obviously, but I think there's a lot to that. However, you needed students. This is the point I pointed out before. You needed students. Where were the students coming from? Why did they think the way they do? So even if you use more terror, it wouldn't mean that you would have stopped that. You might have held it for a few years, but as long as you couldn't shut down the universities, here's the rub. As long as you couldn't shut it down, there was no chance that you could really do anything. So the tactic of terrorism was deployed to highlight, as I said, the state's cruelty. What we see here is 2/3 of terrorists, and they were increasing, were under the age of 22. Again, they've had so little life experience. Now, there's different groups, and so these different, and this is another feature. These different revolutionary groups are breaking off from each other and often turning against each other. Though, because of the state terrorism, they're able to ultimately direct their attention at the state rather than against each other. But this conflict between these groups is, again, it's prescient of what will happen when the revolution takes place. So the Narodnaya Volya had identified itself as a despotic utopia. It broke off from Zemlya Volya in 1879, and it had approximately 500 members, and it was a full-on terrorist organization. On its executive committee was Lenin's brother, Alexander Ulyanov, and he'll be hung for attempting to assassinate Alexander III. So Lenin grows up in a household where his brother has not only been a terrorist, but his brother has been hung for terrorism. Clearly, that's going to consolidate his commitment to overthrowing the Tsar. At the same time, it seems to have given Lenin the impression that the tactics of his brother just weren't smart enough. He had to be smarter. Now, these cells, which, as I said, they begin in the student movement, they also now spread into military circles and workers' circles. And usually, again, it's introduced to the group by someone who's studied, someone who's been to university, but they take off. So people are reading, talking, but committing themselves to political action. This is another thing. This really just confirms the point I made earlier. We have no regrets at having to die. We die for an idea, and if we do have any regret, it is only that the significance of our death lies merely in the shame it puts on the dying monarchy. Blah, 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 blah. Again, you can see this guy would be hung for shooting at police and resisting arrest. But this is the mentality that is going on, that is developing. This is the political culture. Over time, the composition of the student body had changed, most from the lower classes, the largest contingents. So initially, nobles, gentry, sons, but it starts to change. Again, one of the things that's driving the changes is the need for more and more professionals so you can develop economically. So you open up the universities, and as you open up the universities, though, you've got more and more young people with greater ambition, and basically the way in which you achieve respect amongst your peers is to say the same things, to involve yourself in the consensus, not to depart from them, and if anything, prove yourself more radical than your contemporaries, so you will have a higher group status. This is very typical. This is called mimetic behavior. We just copy each other, and this is a common phenomenon of human beings. We can see this wherever consensuses occur. People then vie with each other to push the group more in the direction that seems to be the underlying narrative core which holds that group together. And this certainly happens within the student movement. It becomes increasingly radicalized as it's drawn more people in. So hereditary nobles each had less than 10%. Now, I mention this because in the case of the Jews, we will see that they are going to be very important in the development of socialism. And we'll look at the reasons why that is the case a bit later. In 1884, the student associations were declared illegal, but it didn't matter. They were secret. It didn't matter. In 1899, 25,000 students, now out of a total of 35,000 students in the empire, boycotted classes in reaction to a prohibition of celebrating the founding of the University of St. Petersburg. This gives you an idea, first of all, of how many students, I had said so, over 60% of students are prepared to boycott classes. Now, this, in reaction to prohibiting the celebrating the founding of the University of St. Petersburg, this just goes to show how terrified, really, the authorities are of what is happening in the student group. And they're terrified because these places aren't just essential sites where education takes place so that you can train people to develop the country. They're also sites where terrorist cells are being formed, and they are also destroying the country. So you've got this dialectic of simultaneously advancement and destruction. And this is the terrible thing. In 1901, disturbances led to assassination by a student of the education minister. And in 1902, another student killed a minister of the interior. So again, now let's turn to the peasantry. This is from Richard Pipes. I think I said to you before that Richard Pipes is often criticised for being a Cold War warrior. I still think his book, that is, he was very critical of the Russian Revolution. He was Polish. Anyone who was a Pole who was not critical of the revolution was insane. Because the Poles in the 19th century, end of the 18th century, 19th century, Poland had ceased to exist. Then, when it tries to secure its freedom, it eventually gets completely crushed by the Soviets. And it's divided up really between the Soviets and the Nazis in what's called the Nazi-Soviet pact for a while before the Germans then turned on the Soviets. But then the Soviets would also go in and completely destroy Warsaw, and ultimately they will turn Poland into a kind of suzerain state, that is a subordinate state, part of the satellite states of the Soviet bloc. So that he's critical of communism is all too understandable. In fact, I've hardly met anyone from Poland that isn't, because they've had the first-hand experience of this. Whereas in North America and Australia, a lot of people are much more, in a sense, neutral about Soviet communism because they never lived there. They never had any experience of it. Okay. So I mentioned this, why I'm mentioning Pipes. Pipes' book, as I also said, its virtue is the emphasis it places on the intelligentsia. And I would say the other really good book on the Russian Revolution, that its emphasis is upon the army and the war, is Sean McMeekin's book. And I think between them, they provide very, very good. There's lots and lots of very good books on the Soviet Union, don't get me wrong. And if you want to, the Stalin period, Stephen Kotkin's biography is superb. Okay. So here, this gives you an idea of what is going on in terms of land. At the beginning of the 20th century, 77.2% of the rural households in 50 provinces of the tilled land, they were communal. So that it already was communal. But the communes, as I said, were being run by the peasants. They weren't state-run. So there's a very big difference between the kind of collectivist, but it was kind of collectivist decision-making, but with private plots, are all part of a commune. Very different to what the state would want to do when it wanted to introduce collective farming, which it did with the victory of the Bolsheviks, and stopped doing it, as we will see, and then it re-intensified it under Stalin. As again, he rightly points out that there's a widespread impression that Russia in 1917 was a sort of feudal country in which the imperial court, the church, and small minority of wealth nobles owned the bulk of the land. That's basically that it's something like France was. And as he points out, this is just not true. Nothing could be further from the truth. The image derives from conditions in pre-1889 France, which you recall, that does sound like that, where indeed the vast majority of peasants tilled the soil. But Russia was a classic land of small peasant cultivators. The latifundia, that's a very large land, had existed primarily in the borderlands and regions taken from Poland and Sweden. And at the time of the emancipation, the ex-serfs received approximately half of the land. I'll just move to this other sentence here. By 1905, peasant cultivators owned, either communally or privately, 61% of the land was in private possession. The big issue was what they were doing to cultivate the land that could make that land, could make that produce commercially viable and ultimately help industrialize the country. This was the serious issue. And on the eve of the revolution, peasant cultivators in European Russia owned 9/10 of their arable land. So they weren't a class that was suffering from lack of land. That's very important, because it often seems, and indeed to the peasants themselves, they might have believed that they had less than they had. And even if all privately held arable land were distributed, this is also from Pipes, amongst peasants, the resulting increase would have been 0.8 hectare per male peasant. It wouldn't have made much difference. So even if adequate land, again, I'll come back to the real issue is the mode of cultivation of the land, not the quantity of land possession itself. That really made little difference. The fact was that Russian techniques of production were extremely backward because the country was extremely backward, even though it was modernizing. And here's the point, it was modernizing, but it hadn't modernized enough. Okay, next thing. Marxism enters into the narrative of the intelligentsia. Prior to that, if we take intellectuals like Alexander Herzen or Chernyshevsky, or various other populist authors, revolutionaries, they're basically using a kind of peasant commune model as the ideal. Now, that's not completely dropped by the Bolsheviks. Not completely dropped. But you recall that Marx's vision was of industrialization, of building up the modes of production, having a more efficient technological class-based system, that is, and the class-based system would be more efficient if you got rid of the tension or the conflict between the classes, if you got rid of the investor class, the bourgeois class, the private property class. If you got rid of private property, then socialism would be victorious. But Marx said this would only come once the means of production was sufficiently socialized. In fact, in the book, The Communist Manifesto, Marx goes on and on about what great things in terms of technological advancement the bourgeoisie and bourgeois society have done. But then he says, but there will be a point at which it's a fetter. It stops production. Now, the problem was in Russia, production was nothing like in Western Europe. But on the other hand, if you look globally, very little, I made this point last week, very little of it confirmed to the picture that Marx envisaged for bourgeois society. Okay, so Marx's Capital appears in 1872. And while in exile, George Plekhanov, who becomes the major Marxist theorist, it's basically just regurgitated Marx. It just takes what Marx says and says it again. And Vera Zasulich, who we had met before, they form a group. And they emphasize against the populace that it's the working class, not the peasantry, that will spearhead socialism. Now, this is going to be very important, because we will see that when we look at the socialist revolutionaries, the so-called SRs, and we compare them to the social democrats, as they will be called, not to be, that term really now is synonymous with socialists and communists, not to be confused with what it starts to mean later in the 20th century, which is mean a kind of welfare state. But with the social democrats, as they're called, who will then split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, who will then be pitted against each other. We start, again, see what I'm saying is we start to see these different groups on the basis of ideological doctrine, on the basis of who will support the program, and hence what the program will look like on the basis of what it is to be implemented. We start to see this turning upon itself. This is, again, it's very prescient, because this will be of major importance in how the revolution plays out. These tensions and hostilities that ultimately spring from these different alternative kinds of, and I use this word rather loosely, programs that on the one hand the populists had, and on the other hand the Marxists had, and then we'll see that then different wings of Marxism had. So the socialist revolution, at a time they tended to go together, but over time the Socialist Revolutionaries formed a party in 1901, the SRs. They believed that Russia had its own path of development. They did think that the peasants and ideas about peasant communes and the intelligentsia could work with the working class and get what they wanted. But they didn't think that the representatives of the working class, so there's working class and this representative, should be the decisive leading figures of the revolution. Whereas the Marxists had already made that decision. Lenin had already written a book called What Is to Be Done. You remember me saying there was an earlier book called What Is to Be Done. Chernyshevsky, I'm probably mispronouncing his name if I recall rightly. What Is to Be Done. Only Lenin now basically is saying that we need the party needs to be constituted by these active revolutionaries operating in cells who will provide leadership, intellectual leadership, ideological leadership to the rest of the society. It's very much along the lines of what the student movement have been doing. It's very much along the lines of what Blanqui had been doing in France. It was very different to what Marx generally supported, but the conditions in Russia were such, and given the autocracy and the secret police, what's the word I'm looking for? Infiltration of secret police into socialist meetings. It's a completely understandable reaction why he would do this. Now, in 1903, there was a big split between Lenin and Julius Martov. They were two leading figures in the social democratic movement. Ultimately, they fought over what would the nature of the party be and who would be allowed to be members. Julius Martov was a Jew. He had been very critical, though he had interacted with it, with the Jewish Bund. They will come up again later, this Jewish association. He'd been very critical of them wanting to be separatist in terms of their own sense of nationhood, of the Jews being a separate nation. He was very critical of that. But he didn't think that should thereby mean that they shouldn't be allowed to be in the party. Whereas Lenin was basically all or nothing. So he basically, so to put it in most simple terms, what Martov and the Mensheviks wanted was to have a party which was basically a broad church base. And Lenin was very suspicious of this. And from very early on, and this would be a constant theme of Lenin, trade union consciousness, as you saw it, working class consciousness was too easily misled by sheer economism and insufficient ideological understanding and commitment, which required that a party member be trained in that and thereby pass that on to other party members. So doctrinal purity is going to be very important in this. And another thing over time that will lead to a division between them is the Mensheviks tended to see that the industrializing process meant that you shouldn't seize power immediately. You had to wait your moment. You had to wait your moment, and you would still have some reliance upon capital. Now, ultimately, both of them are just waiting to take power. So I don't want to give the impression too much, and I think there's a myth that the Mensheviks were really nice and lovely socialists and the Bolsheviks were really terrible. I think it's difference around tactics, and ultimately difference around how one read the situation and the consequences of that reading. Anyway, Lenin's contribution, decisive contribution, was his theory of the party. They would have a true revolutionary consciousness. Okay, I'm leaping back. So this has been going on. I want to go back to terrorism just to give you an idea of the scale of it. And that is, I also want to point out that all the parties, socialist parties, whether they're socialist revolutionaries, the more peasant-based party, or the Social Democrats, supported terrorism. So there were 45,000 members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. It had some 300,000 sympathizers supporting terrorism. That's widespread support of terrorism is setting up a political culture, as I said. It's a culture. And what you've got is between 1905 and 1908, around 2,500 government personnel were killed and just about 3,000 were wounded. And in the 6 months from October 1905 to April 1906, there were 827 assassination attempts on government officials, killing 288 and wounding 383. That doesn't even include the several thousand civilians who were also killed and wounded in terrorist attacks between 1905 and 1907. That is astonishing. So you can see, even long before you've got a civil war, and these dates, 1905 and 1908, remember, well, I had said that the Decembrist Revolution might be considered as the first revolution. So let's say 1905 was the second revolution, and then there's the February Revolution and the October Revolution in 1917. Let's say there were 4 revolutions. One completely failed. The 1905 almost completely failed, except that the Duma, the parliament was set up, but it only had advisory. It only had an advisory capacity, and ultimately any power that it had was quickly nipped in the bud by the Tsar. Now, in 1905, there had been a war with, I might be going to say this later, but I might as well say it now. In 1904-05, Russia had been involved with the war with Japan. Let me just say also that from the get-go, the question of the financing of revolutionary groups is going to be very important. That's something that's often rarely looked at. And a historian, Richard Spence, has written on this, and he points out that there's even substantial amounts of money going to the Japanese from some American bankers and financiers to support the Japanese cause, because there were certain things that they really opposed in Russia. And as will come up, one major investor in the Japanese cause in the war with, of course, it's not the only thing, but it's just a thing, was a guy called Jacob Schiff. And Jacob Schiff was Jewish and a banker. I don't want to, by any means, subscribe to any kind of conspiracy theories about the Jews per se, because that's insane, because most Jews were deadly poor in Eastern and Central Europe, deadly poor. But nevertheless, Schiff had witnessed the terrible anti-Semitism, the pogroms that had taken place in Russia, and had basically been, they were populist, so they weren't caused by the Tsarist authorities, but they were allowed to run on by the Tsarist authorities. And Schiff was one of those that thought that Tsarism was ultimately so destructive to Jewish people in Russia. He wanted to support this group of people indirectly. So that was one thing. But as we will later, I might bring up again. But we can see that the Bolsheviks could only have power ultimately if they could get enough money to pay people to support their cause. It wasn't just so money was going to be involved. It would be a similar story in terms of if we're talking about National Socialism. At one point, you also have to talk about, well, what's the economic basis of this? What's the economic lifeline and support system of this? So it's not exclusively of importance, but it is a factor that needs to be taken into account. Anyway, I'm simply pointing out that out of the, I'll just move on a bit, out of the Japanese-Russian War, in which Russia was basically humiliated, it never thought that the Japanese could defeat it. But out of that war came a whole set of protests, and one of them was led by a priest called Father Gapon, and they basically, a group of workers marched upon the Tsar, demanding better workers' conditions, and I'll talk about those conditions in a moment, demanding better workers' conditions, and they were terrible conditions. But that also had, those terrible conditions largely come from the fact that you had a very rapid development, peasants coming into the countryside, attempt to set up factories, do things quickly, you're really changing your social structures, and you'll see wherever this happens, there are problems. There's serious problems of impoverishment, of inequality, etc. But over time, what you hope is that as there's economic growth, then you can afford to pay the working base and provide better conditions for that working base. Okay, so they were shot upon by the Tsar. The Tsar was out at the time. Was not in St. Petersburg, but they were shot upon, and this ultimately led to various further outbreaks of violence and political acts of terror against the Tsar. That's why those numbers are very high there. Now, but I do want to put in perspective that in 1900, so that's a bit before 1905, obviously, out of 150 million people, there's basically 10,000 people involved in public security in some way, in police constables, sergeants, and other political sections. It's what I'm pointing out, it's negligible. When we get to what happens when the Bolsheviks take power, you just see that these figures just fade into insignificance. So often assassination attempts were made upon senior government functionaries, but also ordinary policemen. Often directed at high officials. For example, in 1901, the Education Minister, 1902, the Interior Minister, 1905, the uncle of the Tsar, the Grand Duke Alexandrovich, and most significantly was Pyotr Stolypin, the Prime Minister, who in many ways was a very astute politician, modernizer, who believed that Russia would be that Russia could be saved. Because there were serious questions, can this be saved? It would need to modernize, but the one that could undo it would be if there was a war, and that's exactly what happened. Now, I want to emphasize that terrorism alone did not bring down the Russian state. And we'll see, the role of the soldiers and the role of the workers in their strikes, in the refusal of the Russian soldiers to keep fighting, they were really important. And the revolution wouldn't have happened had those groups not been exploding. But, of course, it's the interpenetration of this. But certainly the political culture is being formed by the acceptance of this terrorist ethos. And the Bolsheviks would accept this ethos. So if we now jump back to the economy, the main point I want to emphasize is it is a complete fabrication that the Russian economy was doing terribly until the Bolsheviks came along and fixed everything. Nothing could be further from the truth. That basically Russia, for almost a generation, had been, in fact, a bit over a generation, was well on the way to successfully industrializing. But there's a cost, as I said, there's a cost to modern industrial development. Its population had increased fourfold in the 19th century. So it was 179 million people by 1940. It was still an agricultural economy, and 55.7% of state income, taxation basically, came from agricultural sources. It was the largest cereal exporter in the world. It exported 40% of the world's grain. So that suggests that developments in techniques and technology were starting to kick in the agricultural sector. The Russian economy generally was the 5th largest in the world. The annual growth rates were 8 to 10%. Now, when you've got a rapidly industrial economy, that is pretty well par for the course. If you're doing well, you're going to have those kind of great growth rates. Once you've industrialized, you're never going to see those growth rates again. If you get 3%, you're over the moon. But output was, industrial output alone was 6% from 1907 to 1940. They're very good figures, as the economists would say, they're sweet numbers. And soaring growth rates, and also with Sergei Vitti as Minister of Finance, again, he was a very astute and very apt Minister of Finance, as far as I can tell. The Russian state was also not simply just leaving it to private investors. This, again, that's another kind of myth. It was heavily directed in capital direction, or heavily invested in capital direction. By the way, there's nothing particularly unusual about this. That tends to have this, put it bluntly, the interplay, I've said this before, I say this in all my classes, but the interplay between state and capital is absolutely essential for a dynamic modern economy. You can't not have both if you want to achieve development. The state has to do certain things. It has to make certain decisions about resource flow and direction. At the same time, and training, the universities, for example. But it also has to let capital also have its own flow up to a point, have its own flow and direction. So getting that balance right, and the Russian state, by these figures, indicate it was doing a good job. So it was realized you need a heavy industry base. It realized you need technology. The majority of banks were government owned. That is not uncommon in a certain phase of economic development. But it did require large amounts of foreign capital investment and not just reliant upon government revenue. That's why you need capital. You need money to come in. And if you only have government direction, you're really limiting the amount of investment you can have. Moreover, when you're rapidly industrializing, as here, labor is relatively cheap compared to other places. So it's a good investment prospect, provided, and this is a very big rider because you don't always have this, it's a very good investment opportunity for investors, provided there's enough stability in the political envelopes. And this was shaky. Because, as I said, there had already been 1905 uprising, but again, had the war not kicked in, although you had these socialist parties, the development was such that it looked like you could get away with it. On the other hand, other things. I'll talk about workers' disruption in a minute, the conditions of workers. It was the 4th greatest producer of coal, pig iron, steel, large gold reserves. So again, commodity production, good. Its workforce had increased drastically from 1860, 565,000 workers to 135,000 of which were serfs. 2/3 of the workers in mines were serfs. So it had risen drastically from that. A huge influx of peasants. And so basically the generation just prior to the revolution of working class, a very large percent of them had not even been one generation cohort of the working class. So they had drifted in. So to put it bluntly, unskilled, industrial, not getting used to very different conditions, and in a way the conditions were far worse in the cities than they had been in the countryside. So what we see here is again 63% in St. Petersburg, 67%, a bit more, of the residents were peasants. By 1914, there were approximately 3 million workers. Compare that to 1860. Now, this is still a very small percentage of overall Russia, of Russian Empire. Very small percentage, but nevertheless. The conditions, they weren't pretty. They were hard. You had 12 to 14-hour days. And wherever the Industrial Revolution kicks in, it looks like it's everywhere, initially. And then things change. And partly they change because of the workers organising themselves into trade unions to demand better conditions. That's one reason they change. But they also change, often the state recognises that if they allow these conditions to continue, that ultimately this impacts negatively upon productivity rates. And therefore some capitalists who have more profits at their disposal work to improve work conditions. So there had been all these studies around this time by Frederick Taylor. This is not the 1880s, but earlier in the 20th century, by Frederick Taylor, about time and motion, figuring out what's the optimum productivity. So there's certain incentives not to keep labour crushingly cruel. But earlier in the piece, that's often the case. Squalid housing, safety regulations, you may have them, but they're widely ignored. Reforms had taken place. So the government realised the problem. But again, labour had organised itself as well. Lowered the working hours to 10.5 per day. Some enterprises, that's what I said, some more profitable and more wanting to get more by realising that less is more, had provided medical care, lodging and even vacation. There has been an increase in wages between 1900 and 1913. Not enough, to be sure. In 1912, social insurance for workers had also been introduced. Again, not for all. There had been an increase in hospitals and schools. 2/5 of the workers worked in plants with 1,000 or more workers. So this gives you a snapshot of what the conditions were like for the workers. And let me just say that as bad as this may look, it would be a long time before Soviet workers would have better conditions, because one of the things that we'll find when the Soviet Union is set up, ultimately, its push for rapid industrialization is such that on the one hand, it opens up a whole slave economy, which you didn't have in Russia. The only other country that had done that certainly on European soil at this stage, where the Nazis did the same thing. So both of them opened up, and in a way it was even more important because ultimately with the Nazis they were prepared to use that slave labour, but they were not only happy to wear it out, but in the main it was a limited pool because they were just focusing on certain groups. They were focusing upon Jews, this is the Nazis, Jews and political enemies, gays, a few other groups, but they were the main ones. Gypsies. In the Soviet Union, anybody could be pulled into the slave operation. Anybody. And that meant there was an infinite larger pool to draw upon. And if you read, the masterpiece on this is by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who actually did spend time in what's called a gulag, one of these slave camps. If you read that, you get this portrait, endless portraits of the kind of things that people did, and family members just thrown into these slave camps. It was horrific. So I'm just wanting, you need to keep this in mind to have a balanced picture of what is going on. To sum up, modernization, in modern rapid industrial development, the initial conditions of the working class as they drift in from the countryside, everywhere you look, are going to be pretty harsh. Generally, the different the players and the state recognise something has to be done, or else the disruption, which involves politicisation of the working class themselves, the disruption will be so great, and the scales of inefficiency will emerge, that there's an incentive to change this. So not surprisingly, given those working conditions, that there would be a radicalization of the workers, of the working class. Now, it's important to emphasize this. The working class played an important but not leading role in the revolution. The reason I say this is because the Soviet system, the Bolshevik system, presented itself as a workers' stroke proletarian, as if it were really the outgrowth of proletarian workers' interests. But as I just said, with regard to the fact that the Soviet Union, its economy, a substantial part of it, not the only part by any means, I'm not even saying the major part, but a significant part, especially to a certain kind of tasks that other people just didn't want to do, especially if it meant, going off and working in Siberia, God-forsaken places like that, or digging canals, certain kind of canals in places, forestry, cutting down trees, also in horrible areas, in tough areas. The working class was never really at home, to put it enormous. How can I say it? They were never the leading class in the Russian Revolution. They were important as an adjunct, but ultimately it would be the party members that would be the leaders, the elite. That is, the people that dealt in narrative and the people that were cruel, ambitious, and hard-willed enough to implement their program. So, but as early as 1881, the workers had demanded violent revolution, destroying all privileges and inequality, and making work the foundation of private and public welfare. You can see this is really no different to what the intelligentsia were doing. It's a kind of mimicking of that. It's a replication of that. But now Marxism has come into the picture. So the Northern Union of Russian Workers, they sought, again, part of the program, to destroy political and economic restraint, to free popular federation of the optionalists based on self-government. That's the MIR, the optioneers. They're the collectivist, villages and what the populace wanted. Remember you saying about how the peasantry were living. So it was collectivist. That's following that. You want to abolish landed property and collectivize labour. So it's a kind of mimicking of what is going on in the peasant communes. There was an outbreak of strikes in 1903, and then in the 1905 revolution, I mentioned that there was a major strike of 120,000 workers. That was in protest over 4 workers being dismissed, and this was led by Father Gapon, who was found out to be a secret police, but then turned against the secret police, and ultimately I think he was assassinated, if I recall rightly, by the socialists. But he was seen as he was seen as a kind of leader of the revolution in one moment and then an enemy of it. Again, this would be prescient of what would happen later. Some, we're not sure exactly how many died. Might have been a couple of hundred, it might have been less. Though journalists then spoke of, it really inflated the numbers. A very similar thing happens, for example, when in Boston, British troops fired upon protesters there early in what would be the lead up to the American Revolution. And the numbers get exaggerated out of all proportion. I mentioned the Tsar wasn't there, but this did trigger off. This is why the strike of 400,000 workers, it was joined by university students. There were massacres occurring throughout the country. There was a mutiny of the Potemkin battleship in Odessa, 2,000 killed and 3,000 injured. Now, this mutiny, this again, the general strike, students, the violence and mutiny, army rebellion, naval rebellion. These are all precursors of the revolution. Here we see the different groups lining up, and that it's the coming together of these forces that's so important. So the government gave way and allowed a kind of elected representatives that set up the Duma, but in terms of the workers, what were called the War Soviets were set up. So these were basically councils to air grievances, and they would play an important part eventually in the revolution. Now, it is a very interesting question of exactly what do the workers' Soviets represent. Do they represent anyone other than the kind of people, the different groups that are constitutive of that Soviet, of that particular Soviet? In what way can they be said to have a larger sort of governmental role to play in overseeing the needs of the society as a whole? And I just leave that open, and we can come back to that. We'll see the way that ends up being answered is ultimately the Soviets don't have much of a future in the Soviet Union. The hope would be, especially of the followers of Leon Trotsky, we'll look at Trotsky a little later, followers of Trotsky, that's really the ideal model of the society, and this is a really great working way to create a fantastic society. What do you do dealing with people that don't take seriously basic economics? And basic economics is the role of what pricing signals do, and the way production works most efficiently is not by people sitting around and having a meeting and then making a decision about what you're going to make, but actually one group deciding something and then testing it through consumers. That's sort of economics 101. I don't know what to say to that. It just strikes me as so fantastical. It fails to understand the very nature of economic information and its gathering and its processing, and it fails to understand the difference between politics and economics, and they're different fields of human action. They impact upon each other, but they are not identical with each other. Basically, political action is just fiat to dictate who can do what and who must not do what, and what will happen if you do or don't do it. But there's not. It might be able to send resources in your direction, but it can't guarantee that those resources will be well deployed. That requires economic incentive, economic advancement, technological. It requires all sorts of other things that don't just automatically flow from politics. Okay, in 1912, so there's still this disruption is going on. There's lots of strikes in 1914, 3,000 strikes. In 1914 there were 3,000 strikes. 2/3 were involving political demand, and this would only intensify as the war worsened. So you've basically got a class of people whose, again, they'd be somewhat radicalized through ideas coming out of the student movement, plus their own experience. And there's some idea of how things could operate, but if, and some of the more proactive radical groups in the workers, amongst the workers, believe that they somehow would be able to go it alone without capital investment. Question is how? Well, you could do it. You could do it if you nationalised industry and you tax whoever and pull resources in that direction. That's one way of doing it. But then you'll have the problem, which I was talking about the worker Soviets, is that you, a particular group, won't have that much say in what you're going to do or not. You will still be beholden to the state. So I just come back to the fact that state investment stroke market, they have evolved over a long protracted period of time. They are not the design ideas of the intelligentsia. They're the outgrowth of a whole lot of collective experiences and problems which has led to resolution through these two modalities of human action. They are not an intellectual design. They are not a product of the human intelligentsia. Okay. The Jewish and national question. I'm going to mention this now because a lot of academics are not sure what to do about this, because on the one hand, it is very obvious that the Jews constituted a significant number of major revolutionaries. If we speak of, I've mentioned Trotsky, I've mentioned Kamenev, Zinoviev, they immediately spring to mind. Martov. The number of Jews in the upper echelons of the Soviet, of the socialist movement was disproportionately high. Now, there's no reason at all why any group should proportionally break down, or any mode of human action should break down into a statistics that's representative of the population. There's a common thing that's coming out of North America, and you see it in Australia too, today. But there's really no reason that should be the case, because what you will find is the different talents, interests, propensities, histories, circumstances all feed into coming up with very disproportionate groups involved in certain activities. And obviously, some people today think that should be tinkered with to have a mosaic that you think is more equal. I think that creates all sorts of problems, but I won't go into that here. My simple point here is, though, although there were a relatively disproportionate number of Jews who were socialists, in part that's because there are some really smart people who were Jews going to universities, and other Jews being so widely mistreated in Russia and its environs, or in the very, remember, it's really a Russian federation at this stage, an empire, a Russian empire, sorry. That it's not surprising that it would attract people that were very hostile to the autocracy, that were very hostile to the regime, and indeed it did. Now, that doesn't mean that most Jews were communists. They weren't. Most Jews weren't. But those Jews that were tended to be very active and proactive and able in the cause. So look at this. You can see Jews were ethnic minorities also. So again, ethnic minorities were seen generally as being disfavored in the empire. So that too, ethnic minorities tended to have a larger percentage. And they formed approximately between them 2/3 of the revolutionary elite. Plus there had been certain pogroms going on. That's just massacres of Jews. Again, at a very populist level. It's not from the government down, but it is from different groups of people who blame their condition upon Jews. And in part, that's because there may have been wealthy Jewish merchants in the area, but then they blame all Jews for that. And part of it is also just, which is going to feed into the Russian Revolutionary just generally, there's a growing hostility. Remember what I said about the willingness to use terror? There's a growing hostility to groups that in any way, shape or form are seen as having more. This has become increasingly commonplace. Even when they don't have, or not fitting in, or being suspect in some way. So there are these pogroms, and after 1905, a further 600 pogroms. So it's natural that people wanting to escape from that will be looking for a political solution that would put an end to this kind of anti-Semitism. The authorities themselves believed there was a lot of Jews involved. The minister of the Interior, Plevev, said something like 40% of Russian revolutionaries were Jewish. There was also the Jewish Bund Socialist Organization that had something like 35,000 members. It predated the Russian Social Democratic Party and outnumbered at 4-1. And whether they should even be allowed to have their own autonomous association. And ultimately, as I said, Martov would say, look, they can have that association and they can be, and we don't really approve of everything, but we're not forcing them to disband. And that would be a source of conflict between him and them. And here's members of the Bund with the bodies of their comrades murdered in the pogrom. This Yuri Zleskin, who's a Russian Jew at Princeton, really great historian in my opinion, done a fantastic book called The House of Government about an apartment block, a huge apartment block in Moscow, and the fate of its members and these basically second-tier Bolshevik functionaries and what happens to them. It's a fantastic book. He writes another great book called The Jewish Century. You can read these figures. My simple point is that the key point that he is making, look at these figures, the key point he's making, most Jewish rebels did not fight the state in order to become free Jews. They fought the state in order to become free from Jewishness, and that's free. That is generally the case. The socialist Jews were invariably cosmopolitan, anti-religious, generally anti-nationalist, but anti the Jewish nation. In some ways, you could even say that they sow the seeds of a certain kind of anti-Semitism, but obviously they're reacting to anti-Semitism. So again, there is dialectic. You can look at these in more detail. I think I've said enough about this, and I'm a little bit behind, so I want to press on. Okay, let's go back to the army. We've been to and froing a bit because they're going to become, again, we're going to see how important they are in the revolution. At the time or around leading up to the First World War, the peasants still provide the foot soldiers. So it's largely illiterate. There's about 30 to 40% are literate. 2/5 of the officers below rank of colonel, peasants or lower classes. It's multi-ethnic. It's relatively egalitarian in terms of the ethos. We recall, to some extent, the Decembrists had already sort of started that. But what we will find is something very similar to what's happened with the Decembrists, and that is there tends to be a general hostility towards the army command structure. So this is going to play out very badly for the Russians in terms of the army. And ultimately, to put it very crudely and bluntly, the revolution only happens because the army is so broken, but there are people with guns who are ready to turn upon others. And ultimately, whoever can manage to get enough people with enough guns pointing at other people at a certain moment is going to have some kind of legitimacy, because the legitimacy is completely broken down. You've basically got soldiers. Now, this is, I'm talking about at the end of the war now and in 1917. But you've basically got soldiers who don't follow orders unless they want to. And you've got all these different groups vying to try and get some unified outcome in which there's simply not unity, but bunches of groups supporting this person rather than that person, this cause rather than that cause. That's a complete breakdown of order. And the only way that order then is reconstituted, you might say, and turns into even greater chaos, okay, but the only way that any kind of marshalling of a state, entrenchment of state authority, is by being able to bring into your side people with guns that are prepared to point them at other people. Okay. So it would be the externality of war would be the real detonator of the revolution. I keep coming back to that. The autocracy had, because of its defeat in the traditional military and its role in the Russian-Japanese War, so you had soldiers in it that didn't respect military traditions, that didn't respect the command structure, that were frequently mutineering, were rebelling against it, and this would only get worse as the war progressed. Now, in 1905, there was a big mutiny that reached the armed forces. So in the first revolution, 2 of Russia's battle fleets, the Pacific and the Baltic, at the bottom of the ocean or in enemy hands. Morale in her third in the Black Sea began to chafe and crack. Sailors supporting the Social Democrats organised a Revolutionary Central Committee, proclaimed a general mutiny. Likewise, in the battleship Potemkin, there was an launched an assassination campaign in 1906. It saw 827 armed assaults from Russian Interior Ministry officials. Again, read these figures. By 1907, a total of 4,500 Tsarist officials had lost their lives since the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. So again, I'm just pointing out the terrorism and then just saying, see how it's in the army. It's intrinsic now into the army. So again, this would be decisive in how things play out in World War I. So in the 1905 revolution, and just prior to that, they'd voted for an elected legislature, a series of nationwide banquets supporting the proposal, but the Tsar didn't want elected representatives. There are various pledges of state insurance for workers, so ground had been given, but ultimately it would only be after the 1905 revolution that any ground would be given. The Union of Unions, it's worth mentioning them, because here we see something that looks much more like a kind of cohort of urban professional interests, which would be akin to what you had in the French Revolution with the so-called bourgeois revolution, and that's how the Marxists saw it, is that the French Revolution was a bourgeois revolution. But as we pointed out, that didn't just mean the merchants, even though the Marxists tend to inflect it that way. It's professionals, lawyers, medicos, engineers and technicians, professors, agronomists, vets. So this now is proactive politically, but without the army, without urban proletariat, without the peasantry, this group doesn't have enough roots to really give them the kind of power that they had hoped to have. And it's in part because it's just not industrialized enough. It's just the way the society is structured. Very different from what France was like. The urban centres, in a sense, are fewer and more concentrated, and the distance is greater. the social distance as well. Ultimately, as I said, there would be the Tsar would turn upon the Duma, even though it was very reluctant to give it any power. There would be 4 Dumas in all, and one would be disbanded by the provisional government in 1917. Now, the point I want to make about the Duma is that on the surface, this looks like where political orchestration is coming from. And what will happen as the war progresses, that the Duma will become increasingly assured of its legitimacy to rule Russia, and it will constantly be attacking everything that the Tsarist regime is doing. And as it does that, there's also in play another group, the Soviets. So you've really got who also see themselves as having authority. And what will ultimately happen is the Duma will have this fake sense of having a legitimacy and authority in terms of ruling, which, as I said, it had used that sense of itself constantly to fight against Tsardom, and then it finds itself isolated. It shrinks, it diminishes, it becomes completely insignificant. Okay, so in World War I takes off. It's originally supported by nearly all the social sectors. That's very important. But early on, it thinks, yeah, we're going to win this. Remember, part of this is also the idea of what's often called Pan-Slavism. It sees the Serbs. You will recall that it's the Serbs that really sparked off the war through the assassination of Ferdinand, and that Germany had given Austria the famous blank check, as it's called, and Russia basically goes to defend its Serb brothers, but also sees an opportunity to curb any appetite that the Austro-Hungarian Empire may have to bring the Serbians into its, or crush them. So there's a kind of pan-Slavic, and that's not, even within the intelligentsia, there's quite a lot of pan-Slavic players. Generally, the socialists are hostile to it. Generally. And they will become increasingly so, as it will, increasingly belligerent. And ultimately, they will win. And the Bolsheviks, the big victory of the Bolsheviks has a lot to do with the opposition to the war, and I'll speak about this in more detail in a moment. So there's production failures, not enough equipment, armament, supplies, poor, leading to a problem of morale. The precariousness of the economy now in the throes of modernizing. There's food shortages because you've had to mobilize more peasants into the army. There's economic disruptions. Production pressures only exacerbate class tensions. So because you have to intensify the productive process, and your workers have to work harder, but they don't want to work harder because they're not getting more bread on the table, because things are worse. Morale in the countryside is degenerating. Peasantry is losing its young men. In 1915, a third of the Russian army had been wiped out. A third, and it was a large army, one of the largest ones in Europe, maybe the largest one in Europe. I can't remember the exact name. At this time, too, there was all these rumors that because the Tsar's wife was Russian, that German Russians had really been interfering with the Russian war efforts. And again, this just as you recall, the hostility towards Marie Antoinette amongst the French was going to be an important part. Motivation within the French Revolution, the hostility towards the Tsar's German wife was also an important source of social unrest and grievance. There were said to be spies at the top, including in the military plant in Petrograd. And then Lenin, who had been sitting it out, Trotsky was in New York. Trotsky would be a very important player early in the revolution in terms of galvanizing people through his great oratory. Lenin had been sitting out the revolution and hadn't been back to Germany since, I think, 1906, where he made a brief visit. I think it was after the revolution in 1905. A wealthy social democrat supporter by the name of Parav had talked to the German government about his idea for Germany winning the war. And he said, you should bring Lenin, you should let him get back to Russia. And he has a lot of support there, and he will destabilize the armed forces. So this came back to Lenin, and Lenin said, well, it shouldn't just be me. I'll do it. I'll do it, but it should be all the socialists. So, and basically this was a way to make, Lenin did not want, and the Bolsheviks always denied this, and it was a lie. Some people say, oh, it's still not proven. I don't believe that at all. But anyway, I think it's a lie. Money was given to Lenin, considerable amount of money, and then more money would be given to the Bolsheviks when they went back. And as I said, other investors would be, and some from the America would be ploughing it in. Trotsky had been in New York, and both the British and the American government had enabled Trotsky to get back into Russia. His passport issuing. There had been groups of communist sympathizers, including very wealthy sympathizers, very hostile to Tsardom. Now, if you recall, the United States and Great Britain were both on the side of the Russians. They're on the same side fighting the war. But the Americans and the British were both deeply opposed to the political system in Russia, and only too glad to see it go. Now, they did not foresee what would happen. This happens all the time. No one foresees what will happen. So they thought they were, and same with the Germans. You know, when you think about it, that ultimately Germany loses the war because of the Soviet Union, and Germany had helped establish, Second World War, Germany helps establish the Soviet state through helping Lenin, who then becomes victorious through the coup of the seizure of government and ultimately through winning the Civil War, takes control of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, what we can see here is that people don't know what they're doing because things don't have the outcome that they think they will have. So they give him a stash of cash. They give him, he's put in this covered train with a bunch of other socialists, but Lenin wants to make it look like that they're just releasing all these socialists, getting the hell out of the country, when really it's Lenin that they're interested in. And because they know his opposition to the war, he's been writing about it, they know he's got a sizable support number there. And if they give him money to go and spend destabilizing the army, this could work their way. So socialist opponents of Lenin would always say Lenin was a German agent, which was true. The only thing is that from the get-go, Lenin was also playing a double game, because while he was happy to take it, he would have taken money from anybody. But he says that really what we're doing is trying to have a socialist revolution all throughout Europe. So he thought, and his pamphlets indicated this, he thought that he could just as easily draw in German soldiers who were supportive of the working class into the same condition as the Russian soldiers, and that they would all overthrow their governments and ruling classes. This was his objective. And it's fantastical. That's fantastical. But here's a really important thing too. Lenin never thought that a revolution would only take place in Russia. He always thought, and in this he's really thinking in terms of Marx's own theory, he's thinking that what would happen, it would be like a domino effect. And what would start in Russia, which he thought, it's weird, it's not starting in the most developed place. That doesn't really, of Western Europe, that doesn't really fit Marx's theory. But maybe we're the weak link in the chain was his formulation. And this weak link will lead to other rebellions in imperial countries under empire, and this will eventually work itself into the most industrialized countries. Now, he also had a problem, as he knew that it wasn't happening in everybody knew that socialism was next to non-existent amongst a very small group of pretty well-heeled intelligentsia in the United States. There was a sort of trade union movement, something like that, called the Wobblies. And there was a Bolshevik support groups in the United States. But in the main, no one was thinking. And in fact, a socialist at the time called Werner Sombart wrote at the turn of the 20th century, why is there no socialism in America? And he gives an answer to that. And so people don't, they're mainly thinking Europe, but Lenin thinks, Europe, there must be a revolution. And the success of our revolution depends upon the success of that revolution. Now, that he will be followed by Trotsky. At this stage, Trotsky and Lenin, by the way, had been vicious enemies. They would quarrel with each other, and they were different sides of the political sense. And Trotsky had gone off supporting Martov early in the breach between Martov and Lenin. So there's a whole lot of socialists that don't like Lenin at all. Anyway, that's Lenin's strategy, and Trotsky believes that. What will happen is it just doesn't play itself out that way. There'll be a brief moment when it looks like there might be a socialist revolution in Germany after the war, but very quickly it's obvious that that ain't going to happen. And so Stalin will eventually pull his belt in and say, no, it has to be, we have to save the Soviet Union. We have to develop it here. When this becomes so good, then they will follow. But we can't keep waiting for some revolution over there. Okay. So look, here's some maps. I don't want to get too far into the actual dynamics of the First World War. But what we can just see is it's the point I'm showing you this map is it's to and fro. It looks like they're winning at one moment and then losing, or it looks like they're losing and then winning. That's the only reason. So in 1916, there'd been a successful assault upon Austro-Hungary, but then Russia retains previously lost territory, but then Russia had lost control of Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics. And then with the Tsar's abdication, that's when all discipline completely collapses. It's completely over by then. So then, what interests the Baltics? What peace conditions can we get with the Germans? They're going to win. Now you remember, of course, that Germany loses the war because the Americans have entered, and ultimately they're fighting on too many fronts. But they essentially had been they were winning the war in the east. They lost it in the west. They were winning it in the east. And at this stage, right up to the negotiating with the Bolsheviks after the Bolsheviks had seized power, basically end of October 1917. There's the Germans think that they're going to get what they want, and everything will fall apart. And in a way, you could say that retrospectively, it's a tactical stroke of genius by Lenin to do this, because ultimately the Germans don't even get what they want in the long term. Now, the big thing comes out of this That's civil war. So Russia gets caught up in the civil war. We'll talk about that. But that civil war is ultimately the making of the Bolsheviks. But again, a tactical success in that. So then the real question is, well, what did they do with their opportunity? And we know what they did with their opportunity. They created Gulag archipelagos. They created they did modernize under Stalin, and they created this great armed slave camp. But one of the greatest military powers on earth for a while, until it proved to be its economic capacity, because it was stuck so much to the program, led it to breakdown. Okay. Now, I also mentioned, I want to give you a picture of this as well, that on the one hand, as we will see, army being corroded, and I've also suggested by the Lenin coming back, the Duma as the ostensible government, even though it's not a legitimate government, but it sees itself as government, it's focused upon one thing: taking power from the Tsar. And here you can just see the numbers of which the antis are. There's others that are more nationalist, sympathetic to the monarchy, and others that are basically hostile to the government. So you've got essentially a civil war within institutions. They're not actually killing each other at this stage. So it's not Russian killing Russian over this, but it is the institution tearing itself apart as Russians are on the front line, either being killed or retreating from disobeying orders. Retreating from the fight or disobeying orders. At this stage in 1915, there's a lot more unity than in 1917. It's not as widely, openly hostile to the command structures in 1915 as it will be in 19. There's other internal problems that are going on, and I'll just mention a few of them. One is the setup. The government sets up two kind of commissions are set up. One is Zengor. It's meant to help the war effort by distributing military orders to cottage industries and more small entrepreneurs. And the other is the setting up of what's called military and industrial committees. They're to act as, and it's basically, both of these are attempts to help the war effort. It's basically an attempt to find a way to alleviate the burden of taxation and create initiative within the country to raise more resources to support the war effort. And the point I want to make is that they both become dependent upon the state treasury. They're both corrupt, and ultimately they're used as bargaining chips with the Tsar to try and get more leverage for the Duma. And this becomes it's one more problem that's ultimately bringing the Tsar down. Now, it is also mentioning, because you might see movies on this, there's a very good British movie. What's his name? Alan Larkin, as it plays the part of Rasputin. Does a very good job. So this is a very interesting example of how something very personal can have all sorts of greater social repercussions. The very personal thing is that Rasputin, who was a monk, this lecture will go a bit longer. We'll probably go another 15 or 20 minutes. Because I'd like to get as far today so I can get the course done. Rasputin was a monk. He was basically a drunk womanizer monk, and he basically had some spiritual rave about how that was all compatible. He was given to, you could say, imaginative flights, or he saw himself as a seer, as a prophet. But the one thing that was really important was that he was able to help, through some concoction he mixed up, the hemophiliac condition of the Tsar's son. And this brought the Tsar's wife very close to Rasputin. She's Russian. the political classes in Russia, not the peasants. Rasputin saw himself, and as far as I can understand, was very popular with the peasantry. It was like home, you know, he's one of us and he's made really good. There he is swanning around with the Tsar and his wife and saving the Tsar's kid, the future Tsar, as he's meant to be. All of this is bringing attention to Rasputin and deep hatred within the political class. The Tsarina, the Tsar's wife, is completely dependent upon Rasputin because he saved the child's life. He's seen as a spy. He has all these ideas about what Russia should be doing, and he talks to the Tsarina and she talks to the Tsar, and they're competing now, and, you know, and other officials trying to push the Tsar in a certain position think, what is this? We're dealing with a bunch of lunatics. Rasputin's a complete nutjob. How can he have the Tsarina's ear? He's performing magic, but he's hypnotizing her. It's insane. This is how. So there's basically, he's said to be involved in a secret police. You know, all this stuff. He's said to be involved in a secret peace treaty with Germany. Now note this. Lenin will be involved in doing a deal with Germany and is successful. But even the rumor, even the fact, but the anti-German sentiments just months earlier are such that, or a year or so earlier, are such that that is enough to tarnish your reputation completely. You can see how the crowd changes, how the winds change. I will just mention one thing I've always found interesting. Is before he died, Rasputin had a dream. And in that dream, and he recounted this to the Tsar, he said, I see an attempt upon my life. I'll be killed. If the killer is of the Russian noble family, I foresee an ocean of blood for Russia. And you and your family will die. And the Tsar and the family, they were all killed. Unlike the French Revolution, the execution of the Tsar and the entire family, the kids, are not just the Tsar and his wife, as like in the French Revolution, the king and his wife, but the whole family. But unlike the French Revolution, also, it was not a publicly orchestrated piece of theatre. Remember me saying the French Revolution, a lot of theatre in it. They were in some isolated place in the countryside, and just one night soldiers just came in and shot them. And that was it. There had been an order for it, of course. Anyway, so coming back to Rasputin, Rasputin says, if I'm killed by a peasant, this will all be avoided. But he was, of course, killed by a conspiracy which involved a member of the Tsar's family. Okay. Now, I said the Duma is constantly pulling at the Tsar. I'll just say a few things about this. Kerensky, who becomes the leader, partly in a set of, it's very complicated. The time between February and October is very complicated, and in some ways, unless you're a specialist on this, the details don't really matter that much at all. But it is very interesting to see how Kerensky, who is a socialist, by the way, he was a Freemason. Remember that, with the secret societies that form, in a sense, a template for other secret societies. But in the main, and the role that they had played in the French Revolution, very hard to get information on it. Very few books that are of any value at all, because a lot of it is just made up mythology and fantasy of people both for and against. That's quite crazy. But he certainly was a Freemason. He was a former lawyer. He had defended revolutionaries and rebellious peasants, but he would also support when he thought things were unfair, he would also support the other side. But he was basically a socialist, not a Bolshevik. And he ends up being prime minister out of, I think, more out of chance and default rather than great political skills. And ultimately, when push came to shove, he showed he vacillated too much. He was too weak. He didn't have, you had to have, basically, to be successful in this chaos. Lenin was your man. Lenin was the man. If you think about Lenin, and he's a butchering Noel, I'm sorry for those that want to idealise him, but he's a man of strong will. But he's prepared to do anything. He is prepared to butcher, and he thinks he knows everything about how to fix up the problem. Okay. Kerensky, and this is the point, in the Duma itself, with the next person who historically is perceived as being a kind of face of moderation. Certainly he was a kind of guy that the Americans, the British would have loved to have done business with. Or certainly much more him than Lenin or Trotsky. He had called for the physical, he had basically called for the physical elimination of the Tsar. His words were struck off the record, but it gives you an idea. It gives you an idea of just the degree of the tension that's going on in Russia at this time, and the role of the Duma in helping tear down. They're tearing down. In fact, what they're all good at, it's like the army. All the oppositional forces are very good at tearing down. Nobody has a clue how to make. Whereas what the Tsar is trying to do is remake Russia from day to day. He can't do it. He can't do it because the forces of support are just vanishing all around him. The army caves in. The army support, and without that, he's gone. He has to give up. The Duma, the political support structure, goes. The intelligentsia hate him. The peasants no longer support. And at different times, the peasantry would be very supportive of the Tsar. There's a kind of mystical aura, a religious fervor, because the peasants tended to be a very religious, unlike the intelligentsia, but a very religious sector of the society. And the Tsar and the church are seen as having a concordance, a unity that's. But by this stage now, the peasantry don't care. He's lost any support. In early 17, he's on an executive, but vice chairman of the Petrograd Soviets. So he's working in the two, because now, as I said, with the Soviets, you've got two groups trying to rule. None of them have really any kind of legitimacy. They're claiming legitimacy, but it doesn't really come from anywhere. Gukov was plotting a coup for the Tsar's arrest. Remember, we came across Gukov. And then there's a scuff breaks out in Petrograd. And basically, what you've got is the absolute lack of willingness to fight, except in relatively small groups on the front. There's panic. There's rumour. Remember the role panic and rumour play in the French Revolution. Panic and rumour give way to sporadic violence. Very similar in this respect. Again, also very similar to the same. Where there's a crisis, the peasantry want to store their food. They want to preserve themselves. This leads to bread shortages, or at least rumours of bread shortages. Then there's a snowstorm that's holding up the trains carrying food supplies. If I recall rightly, the rumours were much worse than the actual condition, but that was partly because the snowstorm holding up the trains, people in the streets are thinking we're never going to get any food. There's strikes for higher wages commencing. There's strikes for higher wages, but who is going to get the money together to pay the wages? You know, partly what the factory workers want to do is take over the factories, but how exactly are they going to get paid? So there's a strike for higher wages. At the same time, you're still in a war. You've still got to pay the army, and of course, it's chaos. So in the Pudilov plant, that was where it sparks off with 36,000 workers, very big, demanding 50% pay rise. They were offered 20%, didn't want it. So then more being forced from. In Petrograd, there's something like 400,000 workers in 900 factories, out of a population of 2 million. So you can see if all these workers are on strike, when they all go on strike, the streets are full of workers. Plus, you've got these underdeployed reservists waiting to go to the army, but they've got no desire to fight. In fact, they don't want to fight, but they're wandering the streets. They've got guns, they're ready to go. And I also wanted you to note, as in the Russian Revolution, the way they're demanding bread, they're demanding grain, and the peasants who are also needing to feed their families, who are also going off to war, are they going to give them this at a price that's not profitable for them? You can see that already, there's that tension. And mass riots were breaking out. Bakeries, grocery shops, exactly what happens in Paris in the Russian Revolution. The Tsar, as in 1905, not knowing what's going on. He was away from Petrograd. So, in two pivotal moments in Russian history, the Tsar, wrong time, wrong place. It's very hard when you study this stuff not to think, wow, it's the fortune. Some people are just touched with bad luck. This is really bad luck that he's not there. So he's away, but he's caught up in the war. He thought the problem was exaggerated. It was being resolved. It all came to a head on International Women's Day, which wasn't only women marching, but workers, students, reservists. And that ultimately led to the Tsar's abdication. They found there was simply no support for him. The police and Cossacks tried to stop the generation, but they ended up siding with them. That was really the pivotal point. There was no one to protect the Tsar. No one cared. Not enough anymore. So there were 300. There were the soldiers there who could have crushed it, but they didn't. They didn't crush it. Again, not enough support, not enough willingness to inflict violence. This is the same with Louis in France. Perhaps if he had been more willing to be violent, he could have stopped it. But then again, you're in that position. Do you really want to do that and everybody hates you? You've already got all these forces against you. If you keep doing it, people weary. And ultimately, this would even happen in the Soviet Union. They had a lot more will, but it's eventually why the Soviet Union fell apart. Exactly, there's a point at which the furtherance of the violence, people can't do it anymore. You'll remember in the French Revolution, the Danton faction, they couldn't do it anymore. They had set up the terror, or they had been one of the groups responsible, but others involved too, but they'd set up the terror in France, but after a while, they just got sick and tired. So you had in Petrograd, the Imperial Life Guard was still there, but they lacked training. They didn't want to restore order. There was escalating violence on both sides. The Cossacks would clear off. And the protesters would ultimately turn some of the soldiers around. They couldn't survive. Immediately then, after the Tsar's abdication, what's called Order Number 1. This would have a huge impact. It was initially issued, it was meant for the reservists in Petrograd. And that declared that soldiers were responsible to their own democratic committees, not appointed officers. That basically meant don't obey your command structure. And this now is issued by the Petrograd Soviet. Who the hell are the Petrograd Soviets? But there's no one in authority. The Duma, the provisional government, doesn't have authority. And the provisional government, who really wants to carry on fighting the war, put a quick end to it, or at least Kerensky does, they're caught short-footed. But Kerensky and as I said, the Soviets and the Duma. I'll talk a bit more about the structure of that in a moment. But this ultimately, it's meant to be rescinded. But it isn't really. That is that it's too late. The horse has bolted. So soldiers have equal rights with citizens. They don't have to salute. This leads to all sorts of mutinies in the army. Now, in 1918, the provisional government, which eventually, as I said, Kerensky takes over, most of those players now, not no one at all, but it was very liberal. It included an amnesty on all political and religious acts, including terrorism, abolition of hereditary, religious, and national discrimination. All very liberal programs. But ultimately, it was opening up the door to its own gravediggers. Kerensky survived. He went off and taught history, I think, in America. He was lucky to survive. He was very lucky to survive. Okay. The Liberal coalition, the cadets, wanted to keep Russia in the war. This was the all-important thing. They did not want to disrupt the food or arms supply. They had a number of agrarian reforms which they put on hold. They also needed the workers to not strike. None of this was happening. So the government wasn't pursuing a policy that had popular support. So it brought them into the conflict with the other three groups, the peasantry, the workers, and peasantry, workers, and army. And they really didn't have a lot of sustenance with the intelligentsia either, who were all much more on the left, even though, as I said, he was essentially a socialist. Kerensky, when push came to shove, the provisional government ended up having a much more, in Marxist parlance, bourgeois character. And ironically, by 1917, because things were beginning to turn around in Western Europe now, Russia's war fortunes looked a bit better. The economy was recovering, it was producing a lot more goods. Germany was suffering food defeats. But then, in this chaos, there's all these peasant uprisings and land grabs, and then peasants coming back from wanting to mutiny from the army to go back and get hold of a plot of land. Again, chaos, just chaos. So it creates the provisional government creates a liberal socialist alliance, but the coalition could not satisfy the escalating and contradictory social demands, especially a quick end to the war. And there was an April crisis where a leak of the foreign minister's telegram, Milyukov, had revealed the government's expansionist war aims, and this really did damage to Kerensky. No one wanted to go along with it. I said, and I'll make this the last bit for today, I had said that the provisional government had to contend with the authority of the Petrograd Soviets. So no one is really in charge. It's a representative body of workers and soldiers, but it does not represent the country as a whole. It just represents its group. And these Soviets start to spread throughout cities and into the army. Okay, I'll start with this slide next week. Thank you very much.